This video is designed to help you understand cognitive behavioural therapy for schizophrenia. So you'll see straight away from the title the fact that this form of schizophrenia is often abbreviated to CBTp, so cognitive behavioural therapy for psychosis. And although it shares some of the similar themes and aims as cognitive behavioural therapy, obviously within the schizophrenia unit, you need to be quite specific about how it can be applied to help individuals manage that condition. We are now looking at this as one of our psychological therapies. So remember, there are some associated and linked therapies here. We've done the biological therapies in the form of drugs, typical and atypical, and now we're looking at the associated therapy to the cognitive explanation. So it is useful for you to be able to recap your understanding of the cognitive explanation, because some of those dysfunctional thinking processes are those that are going to be tackled during a CBTp session. Okay, so just to get you started really, I want you to consider Melanie and have a think about how Melanie's thought processes might be considered dysfunctional, okay? As I say, think back to the work that we did on the cognitive explanations and see whether you can associate her different experiences with those cognitive explanations. Okay, so if we look through and try and identify the experiences Melanie's having here. So one of the things we learn is that she's hearing voices and believes that someone else is projecting thoughts into her mind. The second thing we get to understand about her is to do with her speech and to do with the way that she can communicate and the fact that she's hard to keep her attention. She's saying frequently her conversation goes off on a tangent, and the psychiatrist notes this as derailment. So let's look at that first one, the idea that she has this belief that someone else is projecting thoughts into her mind. Well, the first cognitive explanation we looked at referred to meta-representation. Now, meta-representation is the ability for us to understand the division between what our own intentions and goals are and the intentions of goals that are external to us. And they very much have this sort of knock-on effect, or whether we can reflect successfully on our behaviours. Now, the fact that she's struggling in the first part of this to be able to determine whether it's somebody else projecting thoughts into her mind or whether those thoughts are her own, I mean, we can refer back to meta-representation here. In the second part of it, we get this sense that Melanie's having difficulty keeping her conversation to be succinct. And in this sense, we'd relate it back to that sense of central control. So where we discuss the fact that individuals struggle to suppress automatic thought processes, this could well be why those automatic thought processes that are leading to other different statements she's making that aren't relevant to that particular sentence are coming out, because she can't suppress those parts of the sentence and they're all just coming out in one go. So it is a good opportunity here just to, as I say, recap that. As we work through, you'll see the fact that it's quite key that you understand that we identify these dysfunctional thought processes and give people give individual strategies to be able to replace them with new, more successful ones. Okay, so as I say, as a form of cognitive behavioural therapy, we can lean upon your prior knowledge of CBT that you've developed through the psychopathology unit. And when we did it there, we looked at it as a therapy for depression. Now, in terms of it as an overview and its overall aim, it's still the same therapy. So we're still going to try to identify faulty thinking processes, and we're going to challenge those with the client. We're going to dispute them and argue whether they're successful for them, whether they're leading to positive results for that individual. So it's no different. We're just replacing depressive faulty thinking processes with now the psychosis faulty thinking processes that individuals experience. We then get that behavioural element because we're going to teach individuals new, more successful ways of processing information. And we're going to encourage the client to practice those, try those, and hopefully develop the positive reinforcement that will come from success and a greater level of success that they'll experience when they do use those new, more successful thinking processes. Okay, so as a starting point, this is a really nice way to introduce CBTP because it shows you've just got that overview, but try to use those specific examples that relate to schizophrenia so you can show you're not just describing CBT in general, you are still focusing your answer on CBTP. Okay, so in terms of some details about CBTP, the NICE, the National Institution for Health and Care Excellence, recommend that everybody with schizophrenia should be offered with schizophrenia, and it's, as we say, referred to as CBTP. Now, it is seen as a secondary therapy that would work alongside an individual still continuing with atypical or typical antipsychotic drugs. So that medication would continue, and a nice way of thinking about this is the fact that that medication allows the individuals to control some of the stronger symptoms that are involved with schizophrenia, and therefore leaves them in a position where they can more successfully access a more talking psychological based therapy that can help them deal and manage with some of their ongoing issues that aren't resolved by that medication. So they are seen as working in hand, and it's useful that we don't just see this as a standalone therapy. So how can we work through this process in a kind of logical way in your answer? Well, the first thing you can talk about is the aim. So the aim of CBTP would so that individuals can understand the link and the connection that is going on between their emotional responses, their feelings, the thought processes that they're experiencing, and the behaviours that would occur from that. Now, although these are all interlinked, it can be quite useful to think about the fact that individuals might be presented, if they're schizophrenic, with certain thoughts that are dysfunctional, that's going to have a knock-on effect on their emotions. If you think back to John Nash in A Beautiful Mind, he certainly was experiencing anxiety, aggression, he was having paranoia type emotional experiences, and therefore those types of effects of those thought processes can clearly show that link, which was then having a knock-on effect on his behaviour. He was behaving in an irrational way, he was avoiding social interaction, he was being very secretive, and all of these behavioural responses come as a result from that. So part of the aim of a therapist during CBT sessions is to help the client unpick those different processes and help them see the fact that some of the behaviours they might be showing that are unsuccessful for them are coming as a result of those dysfunctional thought processes. When they work with the client, they'll encourage them to monitor their thought processes, to be able to fully understand what individual processes they're having. It doesn't assume everybody has exactly the same issue, and therefore only by monitoring their own day-to-day processes will they truly be able to understand what they do. And hopefully we get the outcome here, which is an impact on emotions and reduction of anxiety and stress, and the individual experiencing better functions. They're more able to successfully go through what we'd see as typical functioning, be able to engage in usual routine, and be able to contribute, to, not just to society, but to themselves in terms of education, employment, etc. We would see CBT as a relatively short-term psychological therapy, and that's really in comparison with more longer-term therapies such as psychoanalysis, which could run on for an indefinite amount of time, sort of years and years. So we would see this as being a finite amount of time. The suggested there's 5 to 20 sessions. That obviously is a range. I would argue that it's more normal for CBT to go between 8 to 12 sessions, and that's quite important in understanding that it has that clear end point for the client, that they know they're working towards something that will have a finish point and is therefore very goal-driven in what they're doing. So in terms of actually running a practical CBT sessions, I think it's sometimes useful as a student for you to understand the fact that what's going on within that therapy session. So at the start, they'll be encouraged to go back to when their symptoms started to first emerge. We know that individuals might not experience psychosis and any sort of schizophrenic symptoms for quite a long period of time, but then they would go through maybe a stressful experience or some sort of trigger that would bring those about. Understanding that trigger may help them understand the link between certain processes in their life and what's happening, maybe to do with breakdowns of relationships or difficulty within their family, and be able to understand how that might have led to some of the schizophrenic experiences they're having. When individuals think back to their experiences, they'll also look at the content of their delusions and their hallucinations. So they'll try and to sort of see, and this is where we're really drawing a link here between the type of dysfunctional thought processes they're having and how it's influencing how they feel and how they behave. Sometimes this can be enough to have a positive effect on the individual. So being able to realise the fact that because of the false presentation of voices in their mind, they are then now not talking to people, or they're having arguments with people. They can actually start to then have a realization moment and start to approach those situations differently as they move forward. So just doing that can have a positive effect. Also, that reassurance that what they're experiencing is just a false stimulus and something that their brain is essentially presented to them that isn't reality can be quite a reassuring thing, because having that experience of hearing voices can obviously be quite frightening. What we then go through is a process of trying to correct individuals' judgments and try to make them more rational about how they're processing that information. Again, I'm going to refer back to John Nash here, and we saw in the later parts of A Beautiful Mind the fact that he was much more successful at managing those scenarios where he was hearing voices. He was able to be rational with a sense of that's not real, that's something that my brain is presenting to me, and therefore I'm going to put that in a box, or I'm going to process that, and I'm not going to allow that to interfere with or interrupt my usual processes. One thing and some key terms that's useful to drop into your explanations is things like homework and keeping diaries. These are central to all CBT sessions, all types of CBT, I should say. And it's important that individuals see the CBT sessions as the starting point, and they continue to work on the goals and actions set between themselves and the therapist between therapy sessions. Hopefully the end point of this is that individuals develop alternative beliefs. So they're not processing things like hearing voices in the same way anymore. They're processing them differently, and they're able to then apply those coping mechanisms and strategies to make them more functional. We're not trying to alleviate symptoms here. We're not saying that we're going to stop those hallucinations, but we are trying to stop the way individuals process them in a negative way and change that processing of them so they can be more successful on a day-to-day basis. So here's some examples of things that might happen, and this comes from Turkington et al.'s kind of summary of CBTP. So if an individual during a CBTP session stated something like, the mafia are observing me to decide how to kill me, a good response the therapist might come up with is, you're obviously frightened. There's a source of anxiety here. Let's explore where that anxiety is coming from, so that individuals can draw the link between genuine anxieties and how it's presenting itself in terms of their delusional and hallucination experiences. So it's that kind of ration of going, right, actually what's going on here is this. I can't do anything about feeling like the mafia are trying to decide how to kill me, but what I can do something about is process it in a different way. Okay, so for this one, I'm not going to read through all the points on this video, but I do suggest that you have a pause and have a look through. This is another guide to get you to really have that full understanding that when you're explaining a CBTP, that you are able to do so with some really nice sort of clear detail. So here's some other points you can make. Add these to your notes and feel free to, when you're being able to explain this therapy, be able to include these points. Okay, a little bit of an activity to do. Usually in a lesson I'd split you between different groups for this, but as we're doing this as a video, I just suggest that you pause on either Matthew or Sean and you think about how those individuals might be worked with during a CBT session. So consider the structure of that session, think about what we've said should happen as a step-by-step process, and see now whether you can apply it to the relevant dysfunctional thinking processes those individuals are experiencing. So here's Matthew. If you want to, Matthew, pause it now and have a look and do the activity with this case study. And here's Sean. You can have a look at Sean here if you'd rather and do that. If you obviously feel like this is a really beneficial activity, then of course you can do both. Okay, in terms of the evaluation part of this, I have given you an evaluation worksheet. For each of those evaluation points, you need to work through the information and decide whether it supports or contradicts the use of CBT as a therapy for schizophrenia. So this will allow you to hopefully develop those evaluation points that you might need for that. Now, one of the things that's mentioned in that evaluation sheet is the use of blind studies. So I'll just quickly remind you and recap what that means in the context of research into therapy. So by blind study, we mean that the assessor, the person that's going to determine the extent of the symptoms the individual has, doesn't know whether the individuals have been in the CBTp group or they have not. Now that's important because the assessor, we don't want the assessor to be driven by any predetermined belief that this therapy should have made them better or not. We want them to go into it blind, we want to go into it completely neutral and just literally assess the person in front of them without any other views getting in the way. Now, if we see a study has not followed this process, it means we can raise the question of researcher bias, whether if they are a fan of CBT, whether they feel like it should have a positive effect, they do go on to give them a more beneficial assessment in terms of showing that CBT would be more successful. So if you look at the meta-analysis used, then you might find that this is a successful evaluation point you can use to help elaborate the evaluation point you've made.